One of the things that always comes up when I offer keynotes or workshops is that I mention the term VUCA, and that the term VUCA, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, has itself been disrupted. It's been disrupted by a new term, a new kid on the block called BANI, BANI. And I thought, you know what? I'm always quoting this framework. I need to talk to the creator of that framework. So it's a pleasure to welcome for an innovation bite the creator of the BANI framework, Jamais Cascio. Welcome to the show.
Very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you, man. I had to have you on. I like to give credit when I know where the credit is due. And I thought the best way to share this was you have worked with friend of the show, guy who wrote an endorsement for my book, but also a guy who's been on the show, Bob Johansson. You've worked with Bob for a long period of time in Institute for the Future. We also had Ian Morrison on the show recently and have a forthcoming episode with him again on the second curve. He is also linked heavily to the Institute of the Future. Maybe you'll give us a little bit of your background, your link to the Institute, and then we'll give the VUCA framework and why you feel that that's no longer relevant or no longer aptly captures what's going on in the business environment out there.
All right. The one sentence description of myself is I'm an easily distracted generalist. I'm interested in everything, and you wave something shiny in front of me, I'll follow. I have a bachelor's degree in history with a focus on revolutionary movement, bachelor's in anthropology. I wrote my anthropology thesis on the revolutions in Afghanistan. And then I did graduate work, a master's degree in political science with a focus on international politics. Then I worked in the computer field and worked in Hollywood for a couple of years. And basically have found that doing futures work, doing foresight work, offers me the best opportunity to use the skills and information that I've gathered over the years. And since I can get up on stage and talk and talk and talk, or in front of a camera and talk and talk and talk, it seems to be a good fit. So I've been doing futures foresight work for close to 30 years, more if you count what I was doing in grad school. I worked for Global Business Network prior to year 2000, which was a company founded by Stuart Brand and Peter Schwartz, and a few other folks who are very influential and big thinkers in the field of futures. And in 2003, I was the co-founder of a site called realchanging.com. You can see the book behind me. It was, for a while, the biggest green, sustainability-focused website around. And my focus was really on building a better future, building a more sustainable, cleaner future. And I was the primary writer for the site for a few years. And I read a lot. And in the 3 years I was there, I wrote 2,500 articles over those 3 years. And I got a bit burned out. But it turns out that among the people who were regular readers of mine were folks at Institute for the Future. And they said, hey, would you like to come and check us out? I got, basically in 2006, 2007, I started doing work with the Institute. I was never an employee there, but I was on a long-term retainer and involved in all sorts of projects. And so I worked with them for quite some time, about 15, 16 years. I still do projects with them occasionally. But I met Bob there. I met a few other, Jane McGonigal, and a few other really smart, really insightful people. And it gave me an opportunity to think and to think big. So we would do an annual tenure forecast event. And it became a normal thing for me to do a big overarching think about the future talk every year. Whether it was about using evolutionary biology, reproductive strategy theory as a way of approaching foresight, and futures thinking, and all sorts of really crazy stuff that really gave me a chance to dig in. And in 2018, I gave a talk on anarchy and chaos in the global political system of the future. And in doing so, VUCA is a big part of strategic thinking these days, and it's been for a while. came out of the Army War College in the United States in the late 80s. Business consultants love that military language, and so they picked it up really quickly. But after 9/11, VUCA, this concept from strategic thinking, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, VUCA was everywhere because that was a really good descriptor of the post-Cold War, post-9/11 world, where the internet was just taking off, great powers were shifting, the rise of Islamist movements. It was a good, useful term. By 2018, it had become essentially ubiquitous. Everything was VUCA. The joke I made in the talk was that we eat VUCA for breakfast. And it really was something that we're swimming in. And it becomes very difficult to differentiate what's VUCA from what's really VUCA. And I realized that there was a new language. We needed a new terminology to really call out the modern and forward-looking disruptions.
Before we actually go and explain the BANI framework, I'd love you to take us through VUCA, because I thought, wouldn't it be amazing to do a show purely on VUCA and then on VUCA's big brother, BANI, and take us through the VUCA and then the BANI? Because one of the things I'm trying to do with the show is just the way you've reinvented the term, is I'm trying to reinvent the show. I'm trying to go a little bit slower. I'm trying to signpost so our audience really gets it. And it's not just about content. It's about learning and micro learning. So bringing it down to learning at this modular level. So I'd love you to do that. It'd be awesome. And maybe bring us through an example of the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and then the same for BANI. I'd love if you did that, man.
When we talk about volatility in the VUCA sense, we're talking about a state of discontinuity. That is, each step along the way, whether we're talking about in just months or weeks, or whether it would be progression of a project, a progression of a technology, there is an inherent level of disruptive change that comes along with those steps. And volatility means that it's a little hard to predict what's going to be next, but the next step could be a bit bigger, could be a bit smaller, could be off to the side. But the point is that you have to pay very close attention to those changes, because your strategic responses will vary based on the intensity of the next. Uncertainty is really what underlies all of VUCA. For me, uncertainty is the heart of VUCA. It's just not knowing or not having certainty. And that's actually really important distinction between, it's not something that's unknowable for VUCA. You can't be certain about it. And so there's some built-in hesitation. There's some built-in need for adaptation. And for a lot of people who think in terms of VUCA, that uncertainty is just underscores the need to be flexible. Complexity is the term in VUCA that just refers to not just how complicated something is, but how connected it is. Something about complexity, especially in complexity theory and mathematics, but just complexity as a concept in general, is that it's really implied a level of connection between systems. These are interconnected systems, not the isolated, complicated systems. And so something that is complex is if you put one string, it changes settings across multiple systems. And ambiguity always struck me as a cop-out, but ambiguity just simply means that we can't be certain, again, that uncertainty thing, we can't be certain about meaning. We grow accustomed to a particular language or a particular terminology, a particular way of thinking, but as the conditions change, as the environment changes, that meaning can change as well. And so what seemed clear and certain last year may be completely muddled by next. And for me, VUCA was a really nice way of just categorizing the types of disruptions that were underway in that post-Cold War world. Meanings were changing. The facts on the ground were changing. The The ability to make changes to one system, to make alterations to one system, would have cascading effects across others. And so there's growing complexity. And we really started to see just that what it means to have complex consequences in the post 9/11 world. And for a lot of people, VUCA captured that experience. And I think that's how Bob used it for years. Bob Johansson's a big proponent of VUCA as a way of approaching future forward thinking. Um, and yeah, it was useful, but it also became so ubiquitous. And for me, that ubiquity meant that it was no longer sufficient. The VUCA was insufficient to describe the nature of disruptive change in I would argue, in the 2010s, late 2010s and on.
I really appreciate you doing that because I love hearing other people's version of VUCA. And there's a saying I heard, and it became absolutely true during the COVID pandemic, which was if China sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. And we saw that during the pandemic, the impact on supply chains, the impact on world business. You know, you're even seeing it in the States at the moment with the whole elections and what that does to the dollar price, what it does to Bitcoin. Everything is connected now. So I really appreciate you doing that. I just really want everybody to have a clear understanding of this. But now that we understand VUCA, we might now understand why VUCA is no longer relevant and BANI is the new kid in town.
In 2018, as I was wrestling with this talk on anarchy and chaos, I really started to see that VUCA was not accurately depicting the kinds of disruptions that we were seeing, the kinds of, more importantly, the human experience of those disruptions. And I started playing with some terms that I had used in different contexts, thinking about resilience. Well, one of the big challenges for resilient systems is systemic brittleness. That is, a system that appears strong, that may even function as a strong system, but when it breaks catastrophically. It's an abrupt, catastrophic shift. And but we start to see some really serious examples, really dangerous examples of the impact of brittle systems, especially with the pandemic. A system like supply chains, like democracy, that seem to be completely functional, but when something big disrupts it, not only does it stop working as well, it doesn't just stop working as well, it breaks entirely. And people need to have rapid compensation, rapid fixes, rapid adaptations. And so for me, brittleness, the abrupt disruption, was really one of the core features of the new approach to thinking about the world. Anxious or anxiety inducing, that actually came from reading over the commentaries from older Gen Z and millennial, mostly on Reddit, but a few other places, where younger people talking about their lived experience and their sense of no good future. There are no good choices left. All they have is a collection of bad options in front of them. And the sheer anxiety of that sense of hopelessness, of fear, of whether it's depression or just your anger. We see this playing out around the world. It isn't just an American phenomenon or Western phenomenon. It's something that you get younger people, whether they're in China or in India, in Sri Lanka, Brazil, all this raging sense of fear about the future. And it goes well beyond just simple uncertainty. It's just, I'm not quite sure what's gonna happen. There actually can be some certainty. You're certain that it's all that we're doing. It's just that feeling of hopelessness that really struck me as being a critical component of what's happening right now. Suicide rates are up around the world, mostly of men of basically young and moderate and middle adult men. and who, people who should be at the prime of their earning lives, and they can't see, they don't see a future. With nonlinearity, the N in BANI, that actually comes from the thinking and writing I've done around climate disruption, the climate emergency. I've written about climate and climate-related stuff ever since world changing, since the early part of the century. And one thing that I have paid close attention to is the emergence of a proposal for something called geoengineering, which is the intentional use of global ecosystem changing activities. The classic example is people talking about putting sulfur dioxide in the upper stratosphere to block out 1 to 2% of incoming sunlight to hold temperatures. And we know this works because it works with volcanoes. And so it is doing that artificially. And there are all sorts of issues around this. And that's actually been the point of a lot of my writing is what are the political and cultural and social consequences of doing this kind of stuff. What that really underscored for me is just how nonlinear climate systems really are. And that all came to a head for me a few years ago with something where I learned about something called hysteresis. Hystrisis, hysteresis. And it refers to essentially the disproportionality or lag in a system. And the way it fits with climate stuff is that there is a 5 to perhaps up to 25 year lag between introducing additional carbon or greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and changes in temperature. So whether you're talking about putting in more CO2, more greenhouse gases and the temperature going up, or we're talking about stopping putting the stuff into the atmosphere and having temperatures stop rising. And that struck me as a big political question. We can talk about it in terms of geophysics, but it's actually really important as a political question. Because if you get people, societies around the world to make radical changes to their lifestyles, to stop eating meat, for example, or to stop driving anything that runs on gasoline, or to stop flying places. All these can be fairly substantial changes to core identity elements for a lot of people around the world. But as an example, one of the primary characteristics of seeing when a country has advanced its economy is a rapid rise in the consumption of beef, except for India. But that is a sign that the country has money. People start seeing eating steak as being characteristic of being wealthy, a wealthy nation. And so by asking people to make all these changes and then they do and nothing happens, things keep getting worse. Not only do they feel frightened or whatever by the nature of the environmental change, they feel betrayed that they were asked to do all these things and it's not making a difference. And that, of course, added to the anxiety. But that nonlinearity, that disconnection or disproportionality between cause and effect, the input and output, that for me also seems to be a fundamental aspect of the kinds of changes we're seeing, the kinds of disruptions we're seeing. People put a lot of effort into something and get very little as a result. A small thing happens and everything blows up. Finally, incomprehensibility. Incomprehensibility actually got a little bit of pushback on, or a lot of pushback on it first, because it implies that we can't understand something. It's not so much that we don't understand a what, it's more not understanding the why. And so we talk about incomprehensibility or incomprehensible systems. It's not so much the what is it doing, but why did it come to that result? Why did that output happen? A couple of the parallel terms that I sometimes talk about with incomprehensibility are senseless. You think about how often we've been hearing the term senseless around, political violence or around changes to the economy. Why does why did Warner Brothers sell the movie that was complete? Because it was a better tax write-off. That really makes no sense. The other term is unthinkable. Now, there was a guy named Herman Kahn back in the 1960s, wrote a book called On Thermonuclear War, which he coined the term thinking the unthinkable. And that's a lot of what we do as futures people, as foresight specialists, is think about the things that nobody wants to think about. But that also plays into this notion of incomprehensibility, of being unwilling to think about the kinds of disruptive and dynamic changes that are happening. And so these four terms for me don't replace VUCA so much as they build upon and refine VUCA for the modern era and for what I think the 2020s and 2030s will look like. I have no doubt that at some point in the future, it will be something to replace BANI. But right now, I think that BANI is a more accurate way of describing the world in which we live.
Great job, man. I want to share as well, you're writing a book about this. You're contextualizing that framework as well. Maybe you'll share a bit about.
Sure. Well, it's still in its early stages. The idea is that hopefully by 2026, because the nature of the publishing process, I'll have a book out. And I'm working actually with Bob Johansson, because I think he has a really good sense of the big picture and how organizations, businesses make use of concepts like VUCA and BANI, and he started to use BANI in his work. And I'm working with Angela Williams, who is the director of United Way Worldwide, because what she'll be doing is talking about what are the real world experiences of brittleness and anxiety, etc. Basically, I'll be focusing on the conceptual framework. Bob will be focusing on the tool aspect. Angela will be focusing on the impact. And so I think it's a nice combination of voices. And the idea is that our belief is that the next few years will get even more chaotic. And this will be a useful way of understanding the chaos. One of the things that I have come to recognize is that just like old myths and magic, names have power. Giving a name to something gives you a sense of power. And for a lot of people, when I wrote that piece about BANI and made it public in April of 2020, just at the outset of the pandemic, it was just exploded. It took off at warp speed, with people around the world picking it up and using it and telling me that this resonates, this works, because it gave name to what they were experiencing. VUCA was no longer enough, so they needed something else, and they needed something that actually fit what they observed and what they experienced. And so BANI, for me, was my way of giving a name to that reality, and therefore giving people some power over it. Because if they know that this is a brittle system, well, we can think about what we do to push back against brittle systems. We can talk about resilience. We can talk about flexibility and go on from there. And so with the book will be a way of, one, making a definitive statement about what BANI is. Because a lot of people have written about it, but this will be the volume that says this stake in the ground, this is what BANI means. That certainly it will give people a terminology, a language for what they're experiencing in the world. Because one thing we're going to do, and this is something that Bob has been really focusing on, is what's the positive BANI? What are the things that we can do as responses to brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible? Actually, and I have worked out a set of responses, but they don't amount to a BANI. So part of what we've been doing is trying to come up with, okay, what's the BANI version? But the response to brittleness is resilient. What can you do to build your resilience? And the B version of that is bendable. The response to anxious or anxiety inducing is empathy. And really coming to recognize and accept the experiences of other people about what's happening in the world. And acceptance is the A. For nonlinearity, the response to that, I think I really embrace this, is improvisation. Getting away from a script and being able to build out your skill of being responsive to the moment, of recognizing what has gone before and recontextualizing in that moment. And it's not something that happens easily. It's something you have to practice. But improvisational thinking, for me, is the critical way of responding to increasing nonlinearity. And the end version of that is neuroplastic or neuroadaptable. Because I think neuroplasticity is this ability for your brain to reorganize itself on the fly. And lastly, for incomprehensible, one thing that I have learned over my time doing this kind of work is that many eyes can give you a better perspective. I mentioned I worked for a company called Global Business Network back in the 1990s, and its main conceit was that it had a network of remarkable people of all sorts of backgrounds, from artists like Peter Gabriel and writers like William Gibson, people like Danny Hillis and Kevin Kelly. Is basically a range of people who are big thinkers in a variety of disciplines, really wide array of disciplines, and bring those people in workshops, in meetings with organizations, so that the people in those organizations can hear from voices outside of their discipline, outside of their industry. And so that's what I'm really talking about with this diversity of perspective as a response to incomprehensibility. The idea that you have a multitude of people from outside of the narrow way of thinking of your organization, of your industry, of your country. Really a broad diversity of perspective, of ideas. So you're familiar with the term black swan, and this whole story around the black swan concept is that for years and years, centuries, people in Europe used black swan as an example of something that didn't exist. Well, it turns out black swans do exist. They exist in Australia, and it became the term and Nicholas Taleb, he basically used that term as a way of saying, here's something, if it's something that you think doesn't exist, but it actually does, it's a black swan. What I take away from that is that the black swan is a story of asking the wrong people, because the indigenous people of Australia, the Aboriginal people, black swans have known about them for centuries, but they weren't asked whether or not they existed. Or for good reason, you didn't have contact with them. But the point being that for me, the black swan story is asking the right people. Because you may think that something is incomprehensible. It may feel utterly incomprehensible, but maybe you're not asking the right person to look at it. And so the response, diversity of perspective, and turn that into the I, is inclusiveness. And bendable, accepting, neuroadaptive, and inclusive is the BANI, but really means resilient, empathetic, improvisational, and having a diversity of perspective.
Beautiful, man. I love that. And it's like an inoculation, a BANI inoculation. I love
Exactly.
it.
The thing about having a positive BANI is it really underscores that as bad as things are, there are ways that we can respond. But one of the things that we've been really emphatic about in our depiction of BANI, Bob and I and Angela, is that a BANI word is not a word of solution. These are problems that have solutions. These are dilemmas. These are crises. These are issues that have responses. So sometimes those responses will have their own problems, but having a set of responses to the negative BANI issues gives you a path forward, helps you to recontextualize and rethink the nature of the crisis or crises that you're in.
And, it's why I use the term inoculation, because you can't defeat a virus. The virus will continue to morph and adapt, etc. So you need to build your own way to fight against that. And the more natural that is, like these things like resilience, even in a mental sense, be resilient to the fact that things aren't going to go the way you expect they're going to go. I love the way the framework works together. You reminded me of something that Bob taught me when I interviewed Bob years ago now, but even in his books, he said, and I use this to executive teams when I coach or run workshops or give keynotes, is that you have to be extremely clear about your vision of where you're going, but extremely flexible about how you're going to get there. And I think that works beautifully with both the BANI and the positive BANI framework as well. Jamie, final question for me, and we're going to do this again, man. When you have it fleshed out, when you have the whole thing, we'll do a series on the book if you like. I'd love you to share where people can reach out to you, where people can find you for keynotes and workshops, etc.
Well, probably the best way to contact me for keynotes and such is probably on LinkedIn, just because everyone's there. But it's Jamais Cascio, and the spelling is pretty unique. And actually, I really hated the name growing up because actually Jamais is my given name. And the short explanation is hippie parent. But it was a terrible name to have growing up because nobody could pronounce it. It was Jamis or whatever. And it was hard to spell. So I went by James for a long time. But by the time I got into graduate school, back to being Jamais and really building out a career having the name Jamais Cascio, that's been just beautiful because it's Google unique. There's nobody else in the world with the name Jamais Cascio and vanishingly few people with the name Jamais. And so it's been a really useful way for people to find me. So if you can spell my name right, you can find me. If you want to send email, it's Cascio@Open the Future. OPENTHEFUTURE.
And Jamais, JAMAIS, like the French spelling. And it means never, or ever, if you want to take it. And I like the way that never or ever works well for the positive or the not so positive BANI as well. It's been a pleasure, man. I'm delighted we connected. I'm delighted to share your work.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's always good. Useful. It's useful for me to talk about this. It really helps to refine my thinking as I'm working on the book. But also, I think this is an important idea. It helps. It gives people, and not because I'm arrogant enough to think that, well, an idea I have, it must be good. It's simply because my experience of it has been that people around the world, particularly in the global South, but people around the world see it as a term that resonates for them, that gives them a language to discuss the dramatic and chaotic changes we're all going through. Chaos is the core element of this first half of the 21st century, and we need a way to talk about it. And it seems that BANI is that way.
Sure is, man. And it speaks to the very essence of why I do this show as well. I want our audience, I want people to understand this stuff because, in a way, it's an inoculation for fear and therefore resistance, and helps people move on, maybe in their careers, maybe in their industries, maybe in their business. But it was a pleasure to share your work. I'm going to link to it. I'll link to a Medium article that you wrote as well, which is where I first discovered the article. Author and creator of the BANI framework, Jamais Cascio. Thanks for joining us.